This is Democracy Watch. Mark, this is a crazy story out of Ohio. A sheriff whose job it was to provide security at his county's early voting location had been found out for urging people to record the addresses of people who had yard signs supporting Kamala Harris. Do you have an update on this story?
Yeah, this is a crazy story. It's also a really, really troubling story. The sheriff who's charged with protecting people was engaged in this activity. Now, the County Board of Elections voted 3-1 to remove the sheriff's office from its role of providing security at the board's offices during the early vote period. But let me point out what's wrong with that. Number one, the solution to this was not to get rid of the sheriff, but rather to have the County Board of Elections no longer protected, which doesn't seem like it's really addressing the problem that's here. The second is there was actually one Republican board member who was like, nah, I'm totally good with this, right? Like it was a 3-1 vote. I mean, just imagine being the one person who looked at this and was thinking, I'm glad we have the sheriff doing this. Let's get more of that.
Okay. So to your first point then, how is this grounds for the sheriff's office to be removed from its role providing election security, but not for the sheriff himself to be removed? Like, if this guy can't be trusted as a law enforcement official to oversee the safety of elections, how can he be trusted to provide security or anything to citizens? Like, what if a Kamala supporter has a break-in at their house? What if a Kamala supporter gets into a car accident and this is the guy that shows up?
I think the Kamala supporter in that case would be better off going it alone. which I laugh, but it's not funny. I mean, you're right. I mean, this is a further evidence of the degrading of the culture around the Trump campaign. I mean, it is not that long ago that if you had this story, not only would the sheriff have been fired, not only would the county have caused an uproar, but you might have had a Mitt Romney, when he was running for president, actually call it out and say, this is not okay. John McCain definitely would have called it out and say, this is unacceptable. I mean, where is the Republican Party in taking a stand and saying, this is not how we want to campaign. This is not how we want to win. They are not doing that because, in fact, Donald Trump doesn't condemn this. Donald Trump probably approves of this.
Yeah.
And so this, to me, is just a symptom of a larger problem that the Republican Party has put us in which you have one of the two major parties that is fomenting this kind of activity, but also unwilling to take a stand against it.
Ideally, what should happen in this county to ensure that voters aren't left intimidated, even though this person was removed from his role?
Look, I mean, I think that there is ideally what could happen and then ideally what should happen. Let's talk about what ideally could happen, because should is not, should would be decency, should would be a lot of things that we can't expect. I would call on at a minimum for the governor of the state to deploy state police or other resources necessary to provide these election officials the protection they need, number one. Number two, I think the state and maybe the federal government needs to open up an investigation into this sheriff's office to see if there is more here than just this incident. I think that if Governor DeWine wants to be a leader of his party in that state, he needs to take some pretty strong action to ensure that there are free and fair elections in his state, and that includes making sure that local law enforcement are not getting in the way of that. I don't have any hope that Frank LaRose or the rest of the Republicans would ever do the right thing, but from time to time, DeWine shows himself willing to do something, so now's the time for the governor to step up.
Well, this story does highlight the danger of having pro-Trump, MAGA, officials in positions of power over our elections. Reports from Democracy Docket and other outlets have shown that there are hundreds of election deniers either on the ballot or currently in positions of power in key swing states across the country. What worries do you have about this come November?
Yeah, I have lots of worries. I mean, first of all, people should know Democracy Docket actually has a columnist who writes almost exclusively about right-wing sheriffs, Jessica Pishko. So I recommend everyone, if they're interested in more on these kinds of topics, go to the site and take a look at that. But I worry about this blurring between the Republican Party, right-wing vigilante organizations that are clearly associated either directly or through connections with the Republican Party. Then these sort of quasi-militia entities that Donald Trump is so oftentimes, playing footsie with. And then law enforcement, not all law enforcement, but elements of law enforcement that sort of bleed into that, particularly among some of these local sheriff organizations. So I worry about that because it becomes very, very hard to know, where the good guys and all of that are and where they're not. And look, again, mostly the police are helping these situations. They investigate these crimes. They take seriously their obligation to protect free and fair elections. But when we see this kind of activity, it makes it much, much harder for people to rely. And it makes voters fearful, frankly. Right. And that fear can have a really negative impact.
Right. And not to get off on a tangent here, but other police officers should condemn this more forcefully than anybody else, because that does sully the name of the entire law enforcement community and degrades trust in the entire law enforcement community. So they have a vested interest in doing that as well. We've also seen election vigilantism efforts ramp up as we have gotten closer to the election. That's something that you have been very consistent in saying is one of your top concerns this year. What exactly are these efforts, and how concerned should the voters be about them impacting them?
Yeah, so election vigilantism is something we really started to see with Donald Trump coming to power, and it has accelerated ever since. We used to worry a lot about what the Republican Party itself might do. And we worried what states might do, secretaries of state's offices, in purging voters. But what we have seen in recent years is a rise of a affiliated nonprofit world. They are connected to Trump and Trumpism. Project 2025, by the way, a good example of that on the policy side, right? It's not technically the Trump campaign, but no matter what Donald Trump says, it is of the Trump campaign and it is of the MAGA movement. And you see that now in the election subversion, the voter intimidation, and the voter suppression space, where you see this constellation of these right-wing groups funded by the millionaires and billionaires that we've all become accustomed to, who are engaging in low-level intimidation, harassment, voter challenges and the like, but also some bigger, more bolder plans. And so I worry a lot about that as we get closer and closer to election, that those programs will get stood up and more broadly and be more funded. I think from a voter standpoint, you can't let it throw it off your game. Leave it to the lawyers, leave it to the law enforcement, leave it to the campaigns. We will protect your right to vote. We will make sure that they're a free and fair election, but you need to do your part by making sure you're registered, make sure you have a plan to vote, and then voting.
That is the perfect place to leave off. Again, for those watching, to support the invaluable work that Marc and his team are doing in the courts right now, where it's ground zero for all of these election denial efforts, please sign up for Democracy Docket. Again, I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.